Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about literal translation. The present excessive emphasis in linguistics on discourse analysis is resulting in the corresponding idea in translation theory that the only unit of translation is the text and that almost any deviation from literal translation can be justified in any place by appealing to the text as an overriding authority. The prevailing orthodoxy is leading to the rejection of literal translation as a legitimate translation procedure. Thus, Newport, 1983, states that one word of an source language text and a target language word in the translation rarely correspond semantically and grammatically hardly ever. The meaning of many source language verbs is covered in English by Romance and rather less formal phrasal verb, which is likely to be Germanic. Your choice as translator will depend both on the object with which the verb is collocated and on the register of the passage. Varieties of close translation. Word-for-word translation transfers source language grammar and word order, as well as the primary meanings of all the source language words into the translations, and it is normally effective only for brief, simple, neutral sentences. One-to-one translation is a broader form of translation. Each source language word has a corresponding target language word, but their primary isolated meanings may differ. Since one-to-one translation normally respects collocational meanings, which are the most powerful contextual influence on translation, it is more common than word-for-word translation. Literal translation goes beyond one-to-one translation and including. Literal translation ranges from one word to one word, through group to group, collocation to collocation, clause to clause, to sentence. Believe literal translation to be the basic translation procedure, both in communicative and semantic translation, and that translation starts from there. However, above the word level, literal translation becomes increasingly difficult. When there is any kind of translation problem, literal translation is normally, not always, out of the question. Literal translation above the word level is the only correct procedure if the source language and target language meaning correspond or correspond more closely than any alternative. This means that the reference and the pragmatic effects are equivalent. The translation of poetry. Choose Rose Marilyn Gaddis in her stimulating paper on Walter Benjamin in 1982, demonstrating Stephen George's superiority over Benjamin as a translator of Baudelaire's Rime Lament, states the Benjamin German translation goes into literal English more easily than George's, and is not far removed semantically from a literal plain prose English translation of the original, and whereas Benjamin is working with the word, George worked with a large prosodic unit. According to the Newmark, George is the better translator, the greatest of all translators of poetry, but he is more literal in his translation of the words as well as the structures. If a translation is to be regarded, if only partially, as scientific, it has to reduce its options to the taste area. B. And claiming accuracy and economy as its main aims rejects both the open choices and the random paraphrasing of a free translation. Eliminate the universal negative connotations of and prejudices against literal translation. Ordinary or conversational language, however, must always be translated by ordinary or conversational language, and this is rarely literal translation. Many theorists believe that translation is more a process of explanation, interpretation, and reformulation of ideas than a transformation of words. That the role of language is secondary. It is merely a vector or carrier of thoughts. Consequently, everything is translatable and linguistic difficulties do not exist. This attitude, which slightly caricatures the Siskovic school, is the opposite of the one stating that a translation is impossible because AH or most words have different meanings in different languages. All words are culture specific, and to boot, each language has its pe- peculiar grammar. According to Newmark, everything is translatable up to a point, but that there are often enormous difficulties. Words in their context. We do not translate isolated words, we translate words all more or less, and sometimes less rather than more, but never not at all, bound by their syntactic, collocational, situational, cultural, and individual ideological context. That is one way of looking at a translation, which suggests it is basically lexical. This is not so. The basic thought carrying element of language is its grammar. But since the grammar is expressed only in words, we have to get the words right. The words must stretch and give only if the thought is threatened. Elegant variation. Elegant variations on literal or one-to-one translation are common and sometimes satisfy the translator's understandable wish to write in a style or phrase that is entirely natural to him. More often, however, they are irritating to the critic, introduced the exhibit the translator's flair for colloquialisms or synonymy, and even when insignificant, unnecessary. They are not justified in semantic or even communicative translation. They are a temptation and an indulgence for any translator. Literal translation may appear tedious, but there is satisfaction in weighing it against this or that more elegant version and finding it more accurate and economical. Accepted translation. Some transparent institutional terms are translated literally in at least Western European languages, even though the target language cultural equivalents have widely different functions. Thus, President, Senate, Prefect, Chancellor, Mayor note also that concept words such as rad- radicalism or realism are translated literally and often misleadingly as their local connotations are often different, and core denotative meaning is swamped by the connotative pragmatic meaning. The terms are normally so important in their relation to the target language culture that a literal translation rather than transference is indicated. A translated word more than a transferred one is incorporated at once into the target language. However, for new institutional terms, a translator must be careful about translating the terms directly into the target language if they already exist but have quite different functions in the target language or target culture. Concentrates on literal translation. The source language word may be used more frequently within the register, have a wider semantic range than the corresponding target language word. Ordinary language, which in English is usually descriptive language, not colloquial but neutral, and equally appropriate in written and spoken language, marked by phrasal verbs, familiar alternatives such as block, kids, cash, job, and make love. In Pitai, verbs and verb nouns make his way too, and can hardly ever be translated literally. Natural translation. Note that it is sometimes advisable to retreat from literal translation when faced with source language general words for which there are no satisfactory one-to-one target language equivalents even though one is over translating. A further point, one can say that in the human view, all objects are symbols and all words are either representations or symbols of objects. In this sense, literal translation can go either way. The next slide, recreative translation. Recreative translation, contextual recreational as Deleuze 1981 calls it, which means roughly translating the thoughts behind the words, sometimes between the words, or translating the subtext, is a procedure which some authorities and the translation teachers regard as the heart of the central issues of translation. Get as far away as possible from the words. According to Newmark, the truth is the opposite. Interpret the sense, not the words, as, to his mind, the translator's last resource, an essential resource, certainly, and a touchstone of his linguistic sensitivity and creativity, not to mention his alertness and perspicacity. perspicacity. When words mislead, further contextual recreation is likely to be more common in interpretation if delegates are speaking off the cuff than in written language translation, where words are more carefully measured and perhaps closer to thoughts. But most translation is not creative in this sense. You have to like struggling with words before you reach the longer passages. The subtext. The concept of the subtext is a useful variant term for the function of the intention of a text. The thin thread which the translator has the purpose or to pursue throughout his work. But the concept is dangerous and misleading if the subtext starts to obtrude on the text. But differently, if the description or the surface text is partially or wholly replaced by the function, the deep structure of the text, the symbol by its meaning, and so on. Newmark is not suggesting that a literal translation transferring Eton without stating its function is adequate adequate for an average German readership. So, for an educated one, it should be enough. But Eton is an essential element of the translation. The Eton's function, the most prestigious school in the UK, is inadequately stated. Thus, subtext as a reason for embroidering on the original will not stand. If someone says one thing while he means another, that is a psychological feature that has to be cleanly translated. It must be equally inhibited or concealed in the translation. It may or may not be culturally induced, but linguistically, the translation is not affected, must not be tampered with. The notion of the no equivalent word. Gadamer is not going to help the translator at all. His statement, no translation is an understandable as the original, is misleading. Many translations have been and are good. Simple introduction, a lead in into the original, particularly translations of languages such as German with the artificial word order inflicted on them by their scribes. Sorry, the in fact non-SVO subject verb object languages which postpone the lexical elements of their verbs to the end of the preposition. Gadamer uses his statement, the most inclusive meaning of what's said comes to language only in the original saying and slips away in all subsequent saying and speaking as an argument against literal translation. Hence, the translator's task must never be to copy what is said, which seems dangerous to Newmark, suggesting that the translator anticipate to has to anticipate changes of meaning into language of the future. In fact, Kant, Hegel, Heidegger, and Gadamer are initially more understandable in translation than in the original. However, where Gadamer is healthy corrective is in his insistence on the personality of the translator, the translator's state of consciousness and awareness, the limitation of the usually recognized types of context. The rule of context. A good literal translation must be effective in its own right. If it shows source language interference, that must be high the translator's conscious decision. Some might translate one scene in a tourist brochure has a gentle charm, like the local color of the transferred word. New means of creative work ripened and brought fruit later. The translator, unconscious of source language interference is always at fault. The less context bound the words, the more likely a literal translation, whilst the more standard are the collocations, colloquialism, items, stock metaphors, the less likely is a literal translation. Inevitably, There is a proper place for literal translation as a procedure in all good translation. Thank you for your listening. Thank you.